Welcome to 5 Minutes with God. I'm Steve Campbell. We're looking at Romans 16 today. We've come to the last chapter of Romans, and today we'll have a little summary of this chapter, and then in one more session give kind of a final review of the themes of this book of Romans. In this chapter, we see Paul emphasize names of fellow believers. It really is wonderful to see his interest in other Christians. He starts in verse 1 by mentioning Phoebe, who is a servant of the church in Cenchrea, a town not too far from Corinth, where Paul probably was writing from. And evidently, she is going to be delivering this letter to Rome because he commends her to these Roman believers. They should receive her in a way that is worthy of the saints. And she's a helper of many, he mentions in verse 2. And it's still a good practice today to introduce unknown believers in places where they're visiting so that Christian fellowship can really be enjoyed in a very full way. Paul begins then to mention 26 more names in verse 3 and on, and even more that he doesn't name. Some are married couples like Priscilla and Aquila in verse 3. Probably Andronicus and Junia might be a couple serving the Lord together in verse 7. Some are people that he used to know, like Epaenetus and Herodion in verses 5 and 11, and evidently they've now moved to Rome, and he sends greeting to them. Some he greets their entire family, Aristobulus and Narcissus, in verses 10 and 11. Some are hosting Christian congregations in their homes, like in verse 5, probably also verse 14 and 15. And Paul is very interested in encouraging all of these different believers. He mentions Mary, who's labored much, and he mentions Urbanus, who is a fellow worker. He mentions Tryphena and Tryphosa in verse 12, who have labored in the Lord, maybe two women from the same family. He mentions the beloved Persis in that same verse, who has labored much in the Lord. He's so interested and so aware of what all these different believers are doing. He doesn't condescend like the great apostle Paul. He just encourages in this warm-hearted way all these other Christians in Rome. He hasn't been there, and yet he knows so much about them. Then he says in verse 16 that they should greet one another. This is the atmosphere for Christian community to be appreciated. It's an atmosphere of greeting and warm-heartedness ourselves. This is the 10th time we've had a one another phrase since chapter 12 of Romans. It's the atmosphere for Christian fellowship to be interested in one another intentionally. And this word greet is used 21 times just in this chapter. We should be greeting one another. If there are times where we realize that in our Christian meetings there are people we just never seem to get around to greeting, we should ask ourselves why that is. That's not the atmosphere for Christian fellowship. For that reason, verse 17 is all the more striking because it turns out there is someone we should avoid and not greet. It's the person who causes divisions. There do always seem to be some people who are looking for a following, and there are people who are always planting seeds of doubt in the minds of other believers so they don't trust each other. These people, we should not give them what they want. We should avoid them. And other scriptures even say we should deal with them. In the name of peace, we don't just let this kind of conflict go on. Notice in verse 20 that it's the God of peace who deals with Satan. It's not the God of justice, it's the God of peace. And we're told in the scriptures that we should diligently keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. We should care deeply about Christian harmony. And we should be very protective of that atmosphere of unity. In verse 21, Paul begins to introduce and send greetings from his own friends. He's there in Corinth, and many others are working with him. Some are very well known, like Timothy in verse 21, and others are probably not well known at all, like Tertius in verse 22, who takes the opportunity to send his own greeting. He's probably the one Paul is using to write the actual letter in dictation. Verse 23 mentions Erastus, who probably is a very well-to-do believer. He's a Roman official serving in Corinth. And then there's Quartus, a brother. It's quite possibly Tertius and Quartus were slaves. Their names just mean number 3 and number 4. And yet they're brothers together. God puts us all on equal footing in the Christian family. And then finally we come in verse 25 to what probably is the key verse of this chapter and, in a sense, the summary of the whole book of Romans. God is able to establish us. If we are believers in Jesus, we have something to stand on. We stand on the gospel and preaching of Jesus Christ, and God is able to establish us. It's a great privilege because this has been a hidden mystery until the time it's been revealed, and yet it's also a great responsibility because it's presented by the commandment of the everlasting God in verse 26, for obedience to the faith. Then we have this reference to God who is wise in the last verse. This is such a beautiful summary, really, of the whole book of Romans also. How is God able to accomplish all of these things? He is righteous, and yet he justifies the sinner. He keeps his promises to Israel, and yet he is able to invite all individuals to come to him on the basis of grace and faith. He takes people from all different walks of life, and he unites them in Christian community and fellowship. And we certainly can echo verse 27, to God who is wise be glory through Jesus Christ forever. Amen.